A very good evening, team. I hope you are fantastic this evening. It's Rob Stewart with you. It's Wednesday night, and tonight I'm going to talk about some data that I've just pulled out from basically the latest GDP and the CPI stuff, which leads me to believe there's some manipulation at foot at the moment in the figures that are coming out. Now, I'm not one for conspiracy theories. I'm about as straight down the line as I get. I'm definitely not part of the Tin Hat Brigade and subscribe to this sort of stuff. But what I'm going to show you in this evening's session, and if you're watching this on the recording, then please do put your comments in as we go through. It actually shocked me this morning, and it got me pretty riled up. I'm going to try and go through it objectively, but when we do go through this data objectively, I want to draw some conclusions that I personally believe is the state of play, and I'm going to see what you think about that as well. So first of all, we are live, so if you can see me and hear me, please put your thumbs up, and please put something in the comments box. I have just seen, I don't have the comments box up, so I'll bring that up right now. Also, as always, technical issues. So the iPad's not working again. It's not translating. So I've managed to share my screen, but it means I have to look down at the screen to see the slide deck. If you are new to the channel, this is my weekly live show where I go through data, crunch the numbers, get past the headlines that come out in the mainstream media to really understand what's going. So we as property investors can make better decisions, right? So if that's something that you're interested in, please make sure you subscribe to the channel to get future videos and like this, because it gets out to more people. And it's the only favor I'll ever ask you is to subscribe to the channel, because the more people that are part of this channel, the more resources I can put into it and grow it and make it better for you. So with that said, let's have a look at what we are going to talk about tonight. Three things. We're going to talk about the economy and GDP, because we had GDP data released today. We are going to talk about the labour market, what's going on with the labour market right now. That's a good leading indicator of where the economy is going. And I want to talk about CPI and next week's CPI release and dive into the data that I talked about earlier, which I think is going to be really interesting next week. I think it's going to be extremely interesting, but we obviously wait to see what will happen. So let's start with the economy. I don't know if anybody's been watching the news today, but we had an announcement of quite a large drop in GDP. Actually, wait, before we talk about the economy, I should put this slide before the economy one. I want to just reset where we are in terms of the housing market before we talk about the economy, because if you're regulars to the show, you remember that I keep saying that the economy and the housing market are symbiotically linked, okay? I'll show you the cycle in a sec. Housing market, very big picture. All of the indices are showing us down, right? The latest index that came out was the Halifax, which, as you can see here, is minus 5.3% down year on year. The nationwide, off the top of my head, was a little bit more than that, I think. This is all starting to accelerate away a little bit in terms of the year-on-year drops. If we go back 6 months, none of the main indices, Halifax, nationwide, were talking about this sort of level by now. So it feels like it's starting to slide. We've got a lot of leading indicators showing it's starting to slide. I'm not going to cover that tonight. Let's just put ourselves in the context that we're starting to see that acceleration. Now, why is this important when we are talking about the economy? These things are linked, okay? So if you look at this, this is sort of the psychology cycle of housing market and economy. We see fall in house prices, people's net worth in terms of asset base becomes less. That affects people psychologically. Lower confidence means lower spending. Lower spending means fall in GDP. Fall in GDP pushes you into recession. People can't afford things. House prices go down and it comes into this cycle. So I've always said that these two are linked, right? And we need to watch one and the other and see where they're going. That's how I want to pre-frame and start this. Now, here's today's headline. Economy contracts by worse than expected, 0.5% in July. So I think the analysts were predicting a 0.25% contraction. 0.5 is quite a large amount. Now, of course, we go with the headlines. This was taken from a Sky News article. Of course, the ONS is saying appalling weather. Which is fair enough, right? July, this is July's figures, by the way. It's not August, it's July's figures. If you remember, July was pretty wet, pretty cold. But yeah, saying that all of this is down to appalling weather. It might be, there might be some truth to that. But let's not forget that just because it's appalling weather doesn't mean people stop working, stop doing stuff. I run a scaffold company. We were out every single day. Not one site stopped at any one point in July. And we're on probably 20, 30, new build sites. Outdoors, nobody stopped at any point. So let's just, for a start, cut through these headlines that are trying to justify why things are not as bad as they are. So 0.5% down in July. Now, where does that leave us overall for the last 12 months? Well, let's have a look at this month by month for the last 12. And for those of you who are regulars, you'll know that I like to talk about trends. If we don't see clear trends, it's difficult to project where things are going. And right now with the UK economy, there is definitely no trend line. We're seeing this zigzag, seesaw, month by month yo-yo pattern. I covered this last month and said, it's difficult to get into a recession where we keep having like a little pop of productivity with GDP or a little pop in GDP. So if we look at July, recession or no recession, the technical definition of recession is 2 successive quarters of negative growth. Now, I don't know if anybody else on this channel knows, please enlighten me. I don't know if that means calendar quarters or if it's just 2 successive quarters from the last trailing 2 quarters. So if anybody knows that, please give me a comment about that one. But if we look at this, right, so the drop of 0.5% is the same as the rise of 0.5% we had in June. So that kind of cancels each other out. May was a slight drop. So if you look at the trailing quarter, we're down in the last trailing quarter, okay? If you look at the quarter before that, we've got effectively 1 drop and 2 rises. And I think we're very slightly positive in that trailing quarter. So if you look at it right now, we're not in recession. If we define recession as the last trailing 2 quarters, if next month goes red, right, then we are effectively technically in recession, I believe. So a lot of the news is still saying they don't believe we're going to go into recession. A lot of pundits and analysts saying they still think we could avoid it. Surely, we are going to go in. I can't see a scenario where we don't. However, 1 month does not a trend make. Okay, so we'll wait and see what happens next month, because it could well be to the terrible weather in July. Saying that, August wasn't much better. So if we kind of look at the trend line, really it's kind of yo-yo static, right? But we'll see how this starts panning out. Now, I went into the data, went into the report for the GDP, and there was something that I wanted to pull out, which was the construction element of GDP. The reason I wanted to pull out construction, by the way, just if you don't read these things, the GDP covers 3 main things, right? Basically, services, goods, and construction. So construction is the smallest of those 3, but as property professionals or property investors, I think it's interesting to watch where or what's happening with construction as an industry. Now, we can see here the 100 as a baseline, by the way. That basically means that if we are above the 100, we're growing compared to, I believe it's 2019. Yeah, you can see index 2019 is baselined at 100. So if we're above 100, right, we're doing better than 2019. If we're below 100, we're doing worse than 2019. You can see that the overall composite, which is the dark blue, is very slightly above, right? But that's highly boosted by repairs and maintenance monthly index. So the actual new work monthly index is still down, right? And it's actually dropped off again this month. So not a lot, we're in contraction for new work. Construction is being boosted by repairs and maintenance. But if we dive even further into this, right, if we go into sector levels, the main contributors to the monthly decrease, so we did see a monthly decrease this month, were private housing repair and maintenance and private housing new work, which decreased by 3.9% and 2.2% respectively, okay? So the biggest things here were private housing. Now that, to me, okay, is indicating affordability issues. So if we're spending less on repairs and maintenance in our properties, there can only be 2 things, right? Number one, it doesn't need it anymore, so everybody's properties are suddenly amazing. I suspect that's unlikely. Or people can't afford the repairs and maintenance like we're doing. So that, for me, is a bit of a leading indicator, okay, of how people's affordabilities are right now, that maintenance of their homes is dropping off. And 2.2% drop in private housing new work is also showing that those new build sites are drying up. And a couple of weeks ago, when I looked at the last ONS data, we talked about that big spike, that big skew in new build house prices, which I believe was the sort of long tail fallout of the end of Help to Buy. With that gone, with interest rates where they are, and with effectively the property market paralyzed right now, there's clearly less new build development starting, so less builds happening, less supply coming on. Okay, so that was construction. Now, that said, right, I'm just going to go back to that. So, in fact, it will stay here. Go back to this. So we kind of got a level GDP, really, since we had the V from COVID, and then we just kind of flatlined. However, let's talk about the first piece of manipulation we're going to talk about tonight, right? From the top down. Now, I didn't see this in the news anywhere, and I didn't find this in my research. I'll fully admit, and I'll credit the source. I saw this in another YouTube channel, Damien Talks Money, where he did a video on the Blue Book 2023, which is effectively, this is not a new thing, by the way. This is an annual thing that happens. Every year they review methodologies, right, and amend, up or down the figures. It's quite difficult to come up with accurate figures when you're talking about the gross domestic product of the entire country, right? This is not a simple thing to do. However, this year, there has been a fundamental change, right? And actually, this piece of work started, I believe in January this year. So the Blue Book 23 started in January this year. And what they have done, right, and I'm just, in fact, I'll go to the next slide in a bit. What they have done is they have revised their methodology for calculating GDP. Basically changed the goalposts. And now we're using a different data set. If we go to the sort of the main impact of these changes, by the way, I'm not going to go into this report today. I just want to go overview, right? If you go into the impact of these changes, let's just see. Annual current price, gross domestic product, growth in 2021 is revised up 0.9 percentage points. So they put it up almost a whole percent, right? This follows an unrevised fall of 5.8% in 2020. Annual volume GDP for 2021 is revised up 1.1 percentage points. So basically they're saying the GDP is more than they thought it was because they've changed the goalposts. They've changed the criteria they are using. I don't know what you think about this, right? Let's just zoom out a little bit and see where we are. Mini budget, Liz Truss, September last year, disaster. She gets kicked out. Sunak comes in, right? Sunak comes in and pledges to basically save the economy and halve inflation by the end of 2023. Sunak is not stupid, right? By the way, this is all my personal opinion. Sunak is not stupid. He has worked in finance. He's worked in business for most of his life. It is very easy, and I say this from a business owner, to fudge numbers in accounts, right? We can change how a business looks in terms of value, in terms of profit, in terms of loss, by the way we apply certain numbers at certain times. This is not difficult. It's called financial re-engineering. If you want to pay less tax, you can do that. If you want to pay more tax to be able to get more credit, right, we can do all this sort of stuff. Nothing wrong with it. It's just ways of looking at figures. This, to me, right, is a classic financial re-engineering ploy that we've just gone, let's change the criteria. And it's wrapped up in the headlines of, look, we've changed it because we've got much better data now. But we've got much better data. This is going all the way back to 1997. It's being revised, right? So we've changed the goalposts. We've changed how we look at it. And all of a sudden, things are doing better, right? If we look at this graph, so the blue graph, the dark blue graph here, okay, this is the GDP trace from where we are now. The light blue is the impact so far that's been applied for this Blue Book 2023 change in methodology. You can see all of a sudden that it's the light blue is following the dark blue exactly, right, until we get COVID, V, recovery, and all of a sudden this light blue line is doing much better. Much better, right? We've got clear air between the dark blue and the light blue. Now, something to caveat here is right now the changes they've done are only to that time. It was that Jan 21. Okay, so Jan 21 to now has not been revised yet and will be revised at the end of this month into October. And then we'll see the full picture of the revisions of this change in methodology. Now, let's see what's happening. Let's see what's going on here. There is an election coming up. The Tories are getting battered. Why don't we change the goalposts, right, and make it look like we're doing better, or the economy is doing better than it has been? Isn't that a quick win? And let's just wait to release this until we're about to slip into recession, and then we'll change the goalposts, which might well avoid that. By the way, this is just personal opinion. You can make your own opinions, but that seems pretty fishy to me. So that's the first piece of manipulation of data, right? I don't want to go into that anymore today. We're going to go into some even more heinous manipulation of data when we look at CPI in a bit. So I'm going to leave you that and tease you with that in a little bit. But yeah, this is let's just scratch our heads on that, and we'll come back to data sets in a bit. So that's GDP. That's where we are. We are very, very close to falling into technical recession on the GDP. Let's have a look at the labour market, because the labour market is potentially a leading indicator of where we're going. Let's have a look at pay. Okay, latest pay growth comes out. We are now, the bottom two lines there, so the green and the red line, okay, are inflation adjusted. The two light blue lines are nominal. We are very much definitely now inflation adjusted in real term pay growth. Yep, real term pay growth. So when we look at Bank of England MPC meeting next week, which I believe is Thursday, this is going to be a head scratcher, because wages are still growing at a pace. Now, they can't carry on like this forever, but right now, we've now got real-term wage increases. So how is this going to filter into the interest rate decision for that? Market is nailing on a 0.25% change next week. A lot of people saying that's going to be the last one. I think we need to hold that space, team. We need to hold that space. By the way, what do you think? Before I go to the next slide, 0.25% prediction next week. Is that going to be the last? Are we going to stop at 5.5? That seems to be revised down quite a lot more. I don't think we are, but I'll be interested to hear what your thoughts when I come to the comments. Okay, this is this is an interesting graph, right? This breaks down public sector and private sector pay rises. Now, somebody asked me on one of my videos a couple of weeks ago, they're like, right, let's just go back to the previous one. That's overall, but how's it breaking down? Where's the big increases gone? And I said my suspicion was we're probably seeing things like financial services and a lot of management high-level individuals probably disproportionately skewing that data on higher pay packets, bonuses, all that sort of stuff, with the regular working people suffering, okay? This is really interesting, this graph, because if we look at it, right, you can see that the light blue line that has gone vertical, right, that is public sector total pay increase. And when we dive into that, the reason that that is so high is because as a result of the dispute action, strike action, certainly for the NHS, and I'm not sure if it's from any other governmental bodies as well, there were several one-off pay awards that were basically backdating pay from last year before. So there's some significant bonuses that came into pay packets in this period. So actually, this data is skewed from public sector total pay, which is far outstripping the rest of it, right? So regular pay has come up significantly. Total pay, including those bonuses, has spiked significantly more than private sector, regular and total, which has actually dipped a little bit this month. So the majority of the increase is because of the public sector bonuses. Now, by the way, I'm not hating on public sector bonuses. I think it's absolutely well deserved. And there's been pay freezes, all that sort of stuff for quite a long time, and their wage growth has been outstripped by inflation. So that's not the issue. I think what I'm saying here is that there's I would say there's quite a narrative out there that all this pay rise is from private sector, bonuses, bankers, financial service, management, earning loads of money, whereas the regular person isn't. This data doesn't support that when we look at it. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at. So that's pay. Very obviously, that's feeding into the figures that's going to go into the MPC meeting next week. Now, let's look at leading indicator, vacancies. Vacancies, I talked about it last month, has been dropping off quite a lot. As the economy tightens, right, as things get more tough, what's the first thing that's going to go? Are we going to make redundancies, or are we going to get rid of vacancies? As a business, we've got three things we can do here as a business. Number one is, if we have to stop growing, we're going to stop recruiting excess staff, right? We're going to stop adding to that headcount. So to stop adding to the headcount, we are going to effectively stop recruiting, stop bringing more people in at all levels. Vacancies are going to fall. So this is a clear leading indicator, right, that companies are not looking to grow as much as they were recently. However, when you do look at that graph, and I think it's important to zoom out and look at this in context for objectivity, it's still significantly more than it was pre-COVID. So it's quite interesting to see that when COVID came, obviously we're not surprised there's a drop in vacancies, but then the subsequent spike in vacancies after that is significant. Now, whether that means that companies have been trying to recruit but can't bring people back to the workplace after COVID, or other reasons like companies got loads of liquidity and therefore trying to grow, but that doesn't match with GDP. My suspicion is a lot of people went on furlough and never came back. And therefore, companies have been scrabbling around trying to find people to come into their businesses. So rather than growth, right, companies have been looking to bring workforce in just to stay level. And I would say that's a similar experience in my scaffolding business, which I did buy after COVID. But the labour market is so tight. If there's people out the market, it's very difficult to bring in the labour you need just to sort of meet the demands you have, let alone grow. So I suspect that's what's been happening. But regardless, all these vacancies the companies had are now tailing off, which means they're not looking to grow. So I think that's a great leading indicator as to where we are in terms of the labour market as it starts to soften. Let's go from vacancies into employment itself. By the way, again, this is all data that came out today. We've got three things here, right? We've got people in employment, we've got unemployment, and we've got people who are economically inactive, right? So we've got three graphs. Now, employment has ticked down again, right, this month. Unemployment has ticked up again. It's not a huge amount. Unemployment has ticked up 0.1%. So we've gone from 4.2 to 4.3% this month. just to clarify what unemployment means, right? Somebody is unemployed if they have been looking for and available to start a job in the last 4 weeks and in the next 2 weeks, right? So if somebody is unavailable to start a job in the next 2 weeks and is not looking for work, they're going to go into that third category, which is economic inactivity. Okay, so there's actually a fairly large percentage, 21.1% of the workforce workforce age 16 to 64 is in that. Now it has dropped down, that economically inactive, but it's coming back up again. So we're going to wait to see what happens with that trend. Incidentally, I say this time and time again, I'm not going to talk about data manipulation on this one, but the goalposts for unemployment have changed from where they were in 2008 to the 90s. We talk about unemployment being one of the triggers of a major housing crash. Effectively, unemployment now, those people in employed figures, includes everybody with 0 hours contracts who might not be working, includes people who are classed as self-employed, who again, just because you're classed as self-employed on your pay statement or sorry, your tax return, you might not be actually doing any business. So there's been a big spike over the last sort of 10, 15 years since 2008 of people on 0 hours contracts and self-employment, which I believe is flattering those figures. Anyway, add those three up. Okay, when you add those three up, it comes to 100.9%. So either somebody screwed up on the figures there, or there's some double counting going on to make something look less bad. Unless there's people in second jobs, is that a possibility that people working 2 jobs might be double counted and therefore, but if that is the case, does that then mean the unemployment or the employed is higher than it would be? 0.9% discrepancy somewhere. So that's another piece of data which seems considerably flawed on the ONS in this release. Sorry to keep going on about it. There's the graph of uptick in unemployment. Still historically low, but we've got to take it with a pinch of salt. It's the trends that we're looking at. The trends are seeing upticks. Some interesting stats in this. We can see that the majority of the effectively where the employed versus unemployed is coming from is we're seeing an exodus might be a strong word. We're seeing a big reduction of people who are down as self-employed. So we're seeing reduction in self-employed, increase in people who are employed at the moment. And I believe this again is a leading indicator of where the economy is heading. Because when things get tough, the first people that are going to struggle are self-employed. Okay, they're going to be competing against companies with resources, marketing budgets, sales teams, all that sort of stuff. You're self-employed, let's say, tradesman, something like that. You're doing everything yourself. The moment work starts drying up, right, you're going to be scrabbling around looking for a job somewhere else. So with that net decrease of self-employed, both part-time and full-time, but mostly full-time self-employed, that to me is a leading indicator that things are getting tough out there. And interestingly, I have a client who is self-employed as a gas engineer, and he said over the last couple of weeks he's seen his business dry up, which also comes into that narrative that we talked about earlier of quite a sharp drop in private homes maintenance. I'm talking property, I'm talking tradespeople, but that big drop in private homes repairs and maintenance, right? If we're seeing less work out there for potentially self-employed tradesmen, right? And if that's happening now on a bigger scale, is this a sign of things turning and the economy becoming much more difficult than actually the headline figures might be showing? If we look at age groups, age demographics, we've seen this month a big spike. This is the economically inactive, by the way. So this is the split, or this is the change in demographic with economically inactive people. Big spike here in 16 to 24-year-olds. So remember we talked about vacancies a few slides ago. If a company stops growing, the first thing that's going to go in is vacancies. If a company's struggling and looking to shed headcount, so not stop growing, but actually shed headcount, right? You've got 2 ways of doing it. First is to do redundancies. Redundancies and going through a redundancy process is horrific, right? Any company that's gone through it, any business owner here has gone through it. I've gone through it twice. Horrific process. You're almost guaranteed to end up in some form of tribunal at some point, and it's not a pleasant process. So the easier way of doing it, right, is depending on the workforce, right? If you've got 3 people in your workforce, it's not going to be quite the same. But if you've got a significant workforce, every year you're going to have people who come to retirement age or naturally erode away, through retirement or going elsewhere. So with people eroding from the top, if you stop bringing people to the bottom, right, your headcount's going to reduce. A longer term strategy to reduce headcount, but much easier than going through a redundancy process. So the fact that there's more people in that 16 to 24-year-old demographic struggling to get work would maybe suggest that companies are stopping to bring people up from the bottom. People reducing from the top means headcount is actually reducing. And this, for me, is probably the most worrying from that labor report. This is the reasons that people are economically inactive. And that green bar there, which is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, you can see it's sort of, fanning, I'll do it that way around, fanning out as a wedge, is long-term illness, right? So the majority of people, vast majority of people that are economically inactive, long-term illness, and that's getting more every single quarter, every single month, right? So we have to ask ourselves the question: why are so many people going long-term ill? Is it long-term? Is it mental health issues? Is it COVID? Is it younger people going long-term ill? There's more stuff to dive into here, but I think that's interesting to see in terms of the data. Redundancy rate is still historically low, if I'm honest, but that's what the data's showing. When you start looking at the news, right, everywhere you look now, we're seeing more companies struggle, we're seeing more redundancies. Wilco's obviously been very high profile this week. It's not had a package that saved it, so there's going to be significant redundancies there. But look, this is just other headlines that have been in there in the last month or 2 months. John Lewis, Barclays. I saw this today. Buckingham's is a major construction contractor. We actually sub for Buckingham's in the Scaffold group. So the people we originally subbed for, who were subbing for Buckingham's, went under 6 months ago. Buckingham's have now gone under. They've been replaced. We work with Buckingham's on this side, the Liverpool Anfield Stadium extension. It's now another company that's gone into administration. I'm not saying it's because it's on this project, but a company that's on this project has gone into administration. They have been replaced already, by the way. But more indicative, again, of companies struggling, right? Everywhere you look, there's issues going on here, right? Companies struggling, redundancy starting to rise. Interesting, right? That's where we are with this. Before I go to CPI and interest rates, I just want to dive over to the comments team and see what we have in terms of comments. We've got a few nice comments going on. Great information. Yeah, thanks. Waving. Guys, as we go through, if you have comments, please do put them on. I like to try and get this as interactive as possible. That's really important for me to do. So if you have any questions as we go through, please do it. So what's your thoughts, by the way? So a couple of questions I put out there. Number one was next week, interest rates. What's your thoughts about the rise? And do you think it will be the last one? I'm also interested to test the water and see if there's anybody here who is, sort of business owner already. What are you seeing in terms of labour market? Do you feel it's softening? I 100% do. And looking at that data, I feel that it's softening more than we potentially anticipate. Okay, that of course is going to filter into the housing market crash, because if I just go through those 3 triggers that I always like to refer to, right, that are going to cause a full-on meltdown of the housing market. Number one, affordability. We're already there. People are struggling with affordability, right? We've got that gap of still 110,000 people every month coming off cheap fixed rate debt. We're still cost of living crisis, even though inflation headline is coming down. Okay, it doesn't mean suddenly things are way cheaper. It means they're going up at a slower rate, but it's still there. So affordability, yes, we have that as an issue. Negative equity. We're now starting to see people who've been buying in the last couple of years at the peak in negative equity. We're now year on year, 5.5% down, according to both Nationwide and Halifax. I would imagine that's going to be reflected in the UK ONS probably in the next 3, 4, 5 months, but it's so laggy, we won't know exactly. But yes, we now have people in negative equity, and every month that it goes down more, we're going to get more people in negative equity. And then the third one was unemployment. This is the one that everybody's been saying, we're not going to have a big property meltdown because the unemployment will never get that bad, right? The labour market is so tight, everybody's going to stay in their jobs. They're going to carry on getting great pay rises. By the way, when you look at that public sector one, that is a one-off. That is not going to continue. That is basically 2 or 3 years worth of backdated agreement that's gone into that pay packet there. That's done. That's gone. That's not going to carry on going up on like that. So from here, people are going to have, I would suggest, we'll probably be going back into, not negative wage growth, right? We're still seeing strong wage growth, but when you start looking at public sector, private sector, public sector are now not going to get a lot more for at least the next year, right? Because they've just had these, a lot of departments had these large pay rises. There we go. That's my thoughts on that. JR, I'm watching late on the side of May to June estimates in unemployment and economic activity rates. The discrepancy is that unemployment is 16 plus, while other measures are 16 to 64. Cool. Thanks for that, JR. Appreciate the input and the comment on that. Okay, let's go on. Let's go on to the main crux, the main thrust of this live that I want to cover, which is the CPI methodology, right? And data weightings, all this sort of stuff before we see next week's CPI print. I wanted to get this live. I'm actually away this weekend with my kids up north, so I won't be able to go live again until we get the interest rate decision and the CPI print, which I think it's Wednesday actually, not Thursday. But if it's Wednesday or Thursday, I'll be live that night to talk about them. So let's have a look at this. Let's have a look at this, because I want to run you through something, and I want to get your opinion on it too. That's what I want to do. Now, before I go through these numbers, right, and look at what I feel is some blatant manipulation of figures here, I want to refresh a couple of slides that I shared 2 months ago. Now, one of the things that I do when I do these lives is I keep the slide decks from the previous one. So basically building out the slide deck. So I have all the previous slides there that I've talked about before. So I can just go to the slides, bring them back and refer to them and say, look, remember when we talked about this? This is how it's panned out. Everything I share is always my opinion. I'm not an economist. I'm a property investor and a dude on YouTube, right? So there are people who get paid way more money than me to come up with these sort of economic models and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, if you remember, the first time inflation dropped more than was expected, which was not the last one, but the one before, so just almost 2 months ago, we had that drop in inflation, or CPI, headline inflation, which was pretty much credited 100% with the drop in travel costs, and specifically fuel. And that's because the spike in crude from last year, remember we had spike in electricity, spike in natural gas, but there's also a spike in Brent crude, which caused petrol and diesel to go up. Sort of summer last year, that had fallen out of the data set, right? So this big headline drop, it even said in the report, is pretty much 100% attributed to this drop out in the price of fuel and transport costs. I showed you this, which was demonstrating, so this graph demonstrates, this was from that CPI print release, and you can see that the big black line dropping there is effectively the motor fuels element of the CPI. Huge drop off in that in a very short period of time. Okay, now motor fuels and transport is excluded. Well, it's in the CPIH, but it's excluded from the CPI. So this it's not excluded; it's in it. Let me sure I didn't explain that very well. CPI includes everything, but we go CPIH, or effectively core. No, let's go core inflation. Let's not worry about CPIH right now. Core inflation strips out the volatile food, utilities, right? Because these fluctuate quite a lot. So big CPI much higher, core CPI lower, because you strip out those massive fluctuations we had in electricity, gas, and food last year. Interestingly, motor fuels is part of core CPI, right? And that's why they're talking about it having such a big impact. I made a comment at the time that I thought fuel was still a pretty volatile commodity, okay? And therefore, to base this entire narrative that we've got inflation under control, right, because the cost of fuel has dropped down, is a bit of a false dawn, because there was nothing that would happen. There's no reason that fuel could not go back up again. And at the time, I posted a couple of links to articles that were talking literally as everybody was whacking, slapping themselves on the back and saying that the inflation is under control, right? Some forecasts that OPEC were extending cuts in oil output into 2024, and therefore, by definition, if you're going to constrict supply, prices are going to go up, right? I said, look, this is not over by a long shot. So what has happened since then? I want to be on my iPad, but I can't, because on my iPad I can draw on this. You can see on this graph, this is the crude oil Brent price. When I posted that article, we're in the July. So basically at the bottom of this graph, when it was I think it was about $74 a barrel, right? As of today, it's $92.491 a barrel. Okay, so we've gone significantly up in the price of crude. I don't know if anybody else has noticed, but we're seeing significant increases already in the price of fuel at the pump. Now, I actually have an electric car, so maybe not quite as cued into the price of petrol and diesel. Somebody might want to help me. But when fuel goes up, right, this goes through the whole supply chain, because anything that's imported, exported, moved around is reliant on fuel, right? So fuel goes into the costs of that. So we've seen this come up. Now, the same article I posted earlier from Sky talking about the drop in GDP, right? There's a comment at the bottom of it. I just want to read you this comment. So it's the middle paragraph there. Policymakers fear that high. Oh no, sorry. let's go through the middle one anyway. Policymakers fear that high pay awards will only fuel price growth in the economy in the months ahead, forcing further rate action. The final paragraph here says the next inflation figure due in a week's time will also be closely scrutinised, and many economists believe there could even be a small lift in CPI due to rising oil prices throughout August. Lo and behold, right, oil price has gone up, potentially inflation will follow suit. And if they go up and stay up, right, that's going to get baked in more into the figures, not just this month, but for the next 12 months, right? They're going to be in the data set unless they suddenly crash down very quickly. So if you remember how the markets reacted when when inflation did that month where it stuck, it was level, right? It had no drop or rise. I can't remember when that was, 3 months ago. The markets went bananas, right? The swap rates spiked and the interest rates for mortgages obviously followed suit. And that's when we were having 5-year fixed rates up at nearly 6%, 2-year fixed rates were over 6%. Yes, it's calmed down. It's come down, half, 0.75% since then. I would hypothesize that if inflation goes up, if the headline inflation rate goes up next week, right, we'll see similar fallouts. Markets are extremely reactive and short-term thinking. So let's not be surprised if we see that. We'll reconvene next week and talk about the data. I'm not saying it will go up, by the way. Knowing how this all works, right, it's probably a red herring. It's going to drop massively. Everyone's going to be like, oh, didn't expect that, which would be good. And interest rates start dropping. But I think there's a good chance that CPI could tick up or at least stay sort of, where it is, very sticky, which is going to be really fundamental with interest rates and how that sort of pans out over the next few months. Now, let's zoom in on this overall graph of where we are with inflation. So the top two are CPI. The top two graphs there are CPI and CPIH. So CPI is the headline inflation. CPIH is basically inflation with the homeowner costs integrated into it. And then the line at the bottom that's going up is called OOH, which is owner-occupier housing costs. I do not know why this gets why the OOH gets published as a separate rather than the core inflation. I think that's interesting. But we can see that this graph has been trending up, right? So we have no drop in OOH. So anybody who owns a house, okay, needs to be aware of the costs of owning that house. And that includes things like mortgage interest. Now, I'm not going to get into the fact that they don't actually use mortgage interest when they calculate this. They use something called the rental equivalency value. I'll do that in another video because that is a mind-blowing one in itself. So somebody who goes from, I don't know, £500 a month of mortgage interest to £2,000 a month of mortgage interest, right? The inflation data is not going to capture that because the rental equivalency of that property has not gone up the same amount. And the reason behind that is because not everybody's on a mortgage. Everyone's on different types of mortgage. It's not a fair equivalent. So they go, right, what's the equivalent to rent this house? And then that's how they effectively derive the cost of ownership of a house. So it's called rental equivalency value. However, what's very obvious, right, is this line, this dark line at the bottom, is going up. And because of the lag in the system, because the lag in how, rents go up because of the rental equivalency value and all that sort of stuff, right, it's predicted to carry on going up. Now, if this carries on going up, this is a worry for people, right? It's a worry for all homeowners. But when I saw the Blue Book 23 today, right, and how they've just effectively changed the goalposts here in terms of how they work out the GDP, I thought, if they can just do that, what else can they change, right? How are they deriving data? And when I say they, I mean the ONS. Now, the ONS is meant to be independent, right? So they don't report direct to ministerial level. But yeah, okay, we'll get back to that another time. It's meant to be independent. So how do they actually calculate all of these bits of the CPI basket? Because it sounds fairly obvious, right? They have a basket of goods, but how do they work out what bits what, right? And weightings. So I did a deep dive into the weightings that they use for calculating our CPI basket, right? And this is where I've had a little bit of an issue with the data that I uncovered this morning. Now, if I was on the iPad, I would zoom in on this, and I can't actually zoom in on it. So you might just have to look really closely at it. What I've done is I've captured the data mainly for the overall CPI, CPIH data, but also those actual owner-occupier housing costs. And what they do is they have a weightings table, which this is taken from. It actually goes January every year and then February, December every year. It goes back to 2008. I just took the columns away because I wanted to see how they compare. And the weightings table is made of an overall index of 1,000, right? So when you add up all the individual elements, it's going to add up to 1,000. So it's basically each element is weighted as a number that's part of that 1,000. So if we look, I don't know if you can see my cursor here. I'll just go to a number that's obvious. Actual rentals for housing, the weighting in January 21 is 74 1,000ths. Now that doesn't mean it's the percentage of the actual amount, if that makes sense. This is a weighting, so it's a rate of change. So what they'll do is they'll take this weighting figure, right, and they'll multiply that rate of change to then effectively manipulate the bar. I say manipulate, that's the wrong word, to come up with what they believe is an accurate model. Okay, so if something has a higher weighting, it's going to have more relevance. It's going to have more bearing on the overall figure, right? So let's say two things go up exactly the same amount. Don't forget, inflation is a rate of change. It's not an absolute number. It's a rate of change. So let's say two items go up exactly the same rate of change, but one's got a weighting of double the other. That one that's got a weighting of double than the other is going to have a bigger effect on the overall CPI figure than the one with the lower weighting. Hopefully that makes sense. Right, so let's look at this data. If we look, sorry, I know I'm having a look at the screen here. If we look at our owner-occupier housing costs, this row here, in 2021, it's 185. In January 23, or let's go now, February to December 23, it's 160. So they have changed the model. And by the way, they use the same things, that they have changed the model to make it more accurate, and they do it on an annual basis. And I believe, I'll go through it in more detail again tomorrow. They mentioned something about bringing it in line with European standards. I'm sorry, but I thought we were out of Europe now. Anyway, the weighting is less for housing costs, owner-occupier housing costs from 21 to now. And not just less by a little bit, that's actually a fairly decent percentage, about 15% less, 10 to 15% less than it was. Why would the weighting of owner-occupier housing costs be going down when actually the cost to own a house, with rentals going up if you use the rental equivalency value, or just mortgages going up, and all the other costs, which includes, by the way, gas, electricity, all that sort of stuff, going up? So in real terms, this amount is skewing the amount that somebody actually pays on these things, right? The amount of somebody's post-tax income they pay on rent or mortgage or gas or utilities going up, but the weighting is being given in the CPI basket is coming down. Let's look at what else we have. Electricity, gas, and other items. Let's look at electricity. In 21, it was 15. Now it's 22. So the weighting on electricity has gone up. And actually, if you look at this, right, end of 2022, it was 16. So from beginning of 21 to the end of 22, it went from 15 to 16. January 23, it went from 16 to 21. Let's just do the math on that. That's a 33% increase in the weighting of electricity costs. Let's just follow through what happened, right, in that sort of timeline with electricity costs. We're over the peak of the crisis, and electricity costs are now coming down significantly. So we've got an increased weighting in utility costs that are coming down, and we've got a decreased weighting in housing costs that are going up. So by definition, right, if you're having a lower weighting on something that's going to go up, when it goes up, it's going to have less effect on an increase in CPI. And if you're amplifying the weighting of something that's going to drop, it's going to amplify the drop in CPI. What also happened at the beginning of this year, or the end of last year, Sunak came in to be Prime Minister and put a pledge out that he was going to halve inflation by the end of 2023. And what easier way, by the way, again, this is just totally my personal opinion, but when I look at this data, what easier way to solve the inflation figure and to meet your target, that is basically your number one manifesto pledge as you run into a next election, is change the bloody goalposts. And change the weightings. So the things that are coming down are going to make CPI come down bigger, because you're going to put a bigger weighting on it. And things that are going up, let's just flatten the weighting off so they don't actually make so much impact. I don't know what to say any more than that, right? But I feel that is pretty clear. And by the way, I want somebody who's watching this right now to tell me why I am wrong. Not in the fact it's been manipulated, but tell me why I'm wrong in that hypothesis that decreasing the weighting of something that's going up in cost rapidly And increasing the weighting of something that's going down quite rapidly is going to skew the CPI data on a month-by-month basis. And actually looking at those data sets, why that would not put the headline rate of CPI lower than if all the weightings had stayed exactly the same. I would like somebody to tell me that I'm wrong with that hypothesis. In fact, let's just go over to the comments now and see if anybody's got anything to share and shed on that. Yeah, not a lot of comments. Robin is talking about economy, so I think that's probably put out a little bit ago. What's your thoughts on that data that I just shared with you? I would love to hear your thoughts on it, because I feel I want to. I only saw this morning, so I haven't had a lot of time to really sort of process and crunch it in. But just as somebody who did 2 Maths A levels, including statistics, when I look at that, I go, that to me is a manipulated data set, right? That is trying to meet an agenda. I can't see any other reason why that would be skewed so differently. By the way, if I go back to this, oh no, let's go back up. Right, if we look at this line here, line 11 in the overall index of CPIH, restaurants and hotels, it has gone from 68 to 112. Can somebody tell me why it was deemed necessary to almost double the weighting of restaurants and hotels over a 2-year period? Is it because all of a sudden we spend our entire lives out in restaurants and hotels as the British population? Or is it just a nice convenient place to change the weightings? If you change the weighting of something, if you reduce the weighting, let's say you reduce the weighting of housing, you've got to put it somewhere else. It's always got to add up to 1,000 parts. So they've got to see, where should we stick it, right? Let's stick it in restaurants and hotels. Because fundamentally, the cost of restaurants and hotels, the inflation in restaurants and hotels, is mainly due to utility cost and food cost. So again, if we increase the weighting of restaurants and hotels, right, then that's when they start coming down, which they are, because food costs are now coming down and blah, 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 blah. That again is going to skew that data. I want somebody to tell me why I'm wrong with that, because I don't get it. There are some things that have stayed flatline. Communication, right? I mean, transport is a little bit, but not a huge amount. Health, kind of there or thereabouts. Actually, even health is, it's different. Education, that's changed an awful lot. Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on it, team, because that's what I've got for you today. I've probably been rabbiting on long enough, 48 minutes. If anybody's got any questions on that live, I will more succinctly put those observations into a standalone video probably over the next couple of weeks, maybe after the next CPI print next week, because I'm going to be intrigued to see what happens. So as an overall summary of what we talked about today, okay, property market, GDP linked. By the way, these are, I know Robin's considered there are so many factors. There is not just one thing you can look at and go, that's going to drag the economy down. There's lots of contingent things. This happens, then that happens. This happens, then this happens. Things happen, unintended consequences. These are extremely complex scenario, and nobody knows what's really going on, I would suggest, because nobody comes out with accurate forecasting. But anyway, GDP, big drop announced for July. Labour market looks without a doubt to be softening. Unemployment uptick again for the fourth month in a row. More people economically inactive, tick up. More people, less people employed. Second thing. Third thing, CPI next week. We've seen oil prices go back up. Some analysts are saying that's going to feed into the CPI figures and see a little uptick in CPI next week. I feel if that happens, there'll be a big market reaction, and we'll go back to where we were again a few months ago. But if that does happen, by the way, that will probably almost flip my thinking from that really long, low and slow correction in the property market. If we see another surge in swap rates, another surge in mortgage interest rates, right? I think that could accelerate things quite a lot, is my personal opinion, as we go into the autumn and the winter. And I've always said winter 23 and 24 is max pain. And then the last thing to summarize is, is that data set manipulated in any way to come up with hitting a manifesto? I know it's not a manifesto, but basically a pledge to halve inflation by our incumbent prime minister in the run up to an election. I don't know. There you go, team. That's what I've got for you today. Hope that was useful. Hope you found some interest in it. I will see you next Wednesday, I think it is, when we look at the data out of MPC meeting and CPI prints. But in the meantime, have a fantastic end to the week and weekend, and I'll see you next week.